Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hi everyone, I'm your host, Todd Fischer. I'm the founder of Metacortex, and I'm on a never-ending quest for knowledge. A quest is a search for something, and this podcast will show you how we know what we know through interviews with people that have incredible stories of dedication and perseverance. To me, curiosity is part of what makes us human, and there's still so much we don't know. I believe there's joy in discovery. It's what drives us. It's our quest. And with that, welcome to Season 4 of the Quest podcast. I hope you enjoy this next interview. Hi, Robert. Welcome to the Quest podcast.
Hi. How are you?
Great. Thank you for joining me today. So I'm a big fan of your TikTok account. I've been having a lot of TikTok guests that have been coming on, and this has become like a huge deal for people. So I want to start by just letting you tell the audience a little about yourself, your background, where you work, your education, and all that, and then we're going to jump into some really fun questions, I think.
Okay. So my name is Robert Hayes. I did my undergraduate in math and physics, got a couple degrees in those, did my master's in physics, then got my PhD in nuclear engineering. I then went off to industry and worked for 15 years in nuclear waste management and radiological emergency response. And then I did a switch over to academia. While I was in industry, I became a certified health physicist, where that means I'm an expert in radiation safety, radiological protection. I also got my license as a nuclear engineer so that I can do safety-related nuclear science and technology calculations that the public can rely on for safety. And now that I'm in academia, I teach basically what I did in industry. Radiation safety, radiological protection, nuclear emergency response, nuclear forensics, nuclear non-proliferation, and nuclear waste management. And that's what my research is in. I do research in all of those using thermoluminescence, optically stimulated luminescence, electron paramagnetic resonance, and radiological air monitoring. So it's a lot. It's really fun. I would actually add that I think I have the coolest laboratory on campus at North Carolina State University. It's really special. So
I would agree with that. It's funny because this TikTok phenomenon is crazy. Did you think that you would become as popular as you are on TikTok? I mean, right now, I think as of this recording, you're at 118,000 followers and you're nearing 1 million likes, which seem crazy for nuclear engineering. How are people interested in this on TikTok? Which is great. You're reaching people. But tell me about that. Are you surprised?
I am. So there's a story behind that's probably relevant. So I teach graduate classes, and a lot of my graduate classes, you can take it as a senior, as an undergrad, or you can take it as at the master's level. The difference is that if you take it at the master's level, you have to do a research project. And at NC State, we have extremely high standards. And so I told the students in most of my classes that if you're going to do the research project, you have to do it on one of the grand challenges. So the American Nuclear Society issued a list of 10 grand challenges, basically the hardest 10 things that we have facing us in nuclear science and technology. And so I told them, if you're going to do a research project, it can't be something easy. It's going to have to be one of the 10 hardest. And it turns out, if you look at those grand challenges, the hardest, the number one grand challenge was public communication, right? How do you overcome this stigma, this fear, this inherent visceral response that people have to nuclear waste and nuclear energy? It's like this is the quintessential boogeyman kind of a thing to have that. And my students, these are brilliant students, and they generally had a consistent theme. The consistent theme was that you needed somebody that would go out in social media and speak the language of the young people in a way that they could understand it, that would be just the facts, that would actually not have any of the rhetoric or the fear, but just the facts. What are the actual risks? What are the mitigations? What are the control? What is the science there for nuclear engineering. And none of them did anything. They just wrote these brilliant papers and did these amazing presentations. And then they didn't do anything after that. I kept expecting them to, right? It was like, you're a young person. You should do this. This is your idea. Go for it. And then finally, I decided after many years that if they weren't going to do it, then somebody had to. And if it wasn't going to be them, it had to be me. And so eventually I caved in after consulting with other people and decided, if we want to hit the young people, it's going to have to be on their terms. And that means I'm going to have to do TikToks. So
Yeah.
I started doing TikToks. Yeah.
Wow. And what's the response like? Do you generally get a lot of positive comments? Do you get haters out there? What's the response?
It's very mixed. I get a lot of haters. During lockdown, I had to do a bunch of them from home. And being a Christian, I have a lot of crosses. That's one of the ways I like to decorate. And so I also got a lot of real hateful comments. Scientists can't be Christians. I got a bunch of those, but most of them are either, nuclear science is evil, or thank you for speaking in plain language what the truth is about, nuclear science and technology. So it's a real mix. It's a whole spectrum, a big spectrum.
Well, what made you get into nuclear engineering? Why choose that profession? Where was the interest at?
So my real heart was in science and physics. So I love physics, but physics doesn't pay. And back when I was in college, I started a family. And you really can't make a decent living where you can really provide for your family if you're just doing physics, right? And so because my family was growing, I realized I had to go into engineering. I had to make a decent salary. And I really wasn't willing to give up physics and math and science and statistics. I couldn't do that. But it just so happened that after I finished my master's degree, I was convinced, all right, I'm gonna have to bite the bullet. But then I saw that there was this graduate program in nuclear engineering where I could get a PhD, and I was like, that is it. That is so it. I don't have to give up anything. In fact, I get to keep it all, and then add on top of that, this sustainable solution to energy. And so it was just for me, it was just it was a wonderful, heavens open kind of thing.
Sure. Well, for the listeners that aren't really aware of where our energy comes from, let's just kind of run the types of energy that there are. There's coal, nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric, probably a few more that I'm not thinking of right now. Where do these stand on safety and efficiency and cost? Is there a clear favorite or a most responsible choice? And is there one that's just ridiculous to pursue? What are your feelings on energy types, or do they all have their pluses too?
There are pluses and minuses to them all. I mean, probably the biggest plus to coal is that the infrastructure is already there. The ability, all of the needed equipment and training and everything is already there. The big minuses to it are safety and greenhouse gases. There are a lot of pluses and minuses. I would say if you look at it from an empirical and objective risk-based, that if you're looking things at sustainability, at environmental friendliness, at being safe, the best is going to be nuclear. And that's what really shocks people. They think, but nuclear is so dangerous. But that actually reflects fear as opposed to actual risk. If you think that any nuclear reactor is a Chernobyl waiting to happen, then you can see why that would be the case.
Right.
That, if you thought that, 3 Mile Island compared to Chernobyl, or the Fukushima compared to Chernobyl, then you might understand that. But it's not a real simple thing. Nuclear science, to some people, you can understandably see how that would be far more complicated than rocket science. And so it can be very easy to buy into popular myths and popular misconceptions about nuclear science and technology, because it's not something that's necessarily intuitive and easy to understand from a common sense perspective. And that's how a lot of people insist on digesting their information. And so it can be a bit of an uphill walk.
Well, sure. And let's jump into that, because this is exactly where I wanted to go next. I'm 52 years old, so I'm a product of the 80s, right? So I grew up with 3 Mile Island, and I grew up with Chernobyl and the constant threat of nuclear war. It was like, it must be a PR nightmare for the nuclear industry to just know that a generation of children were kind of groomed on that nuclear is bad, although for me as a boy interested in I wanted to be an astronaut, like I wanted to do those things. I
Yeah.
believed in the science. I believed in the future. And to me, nuclear was great. And I'll tell you like a little personal story with me. So when I was a kid, I grew up in Indiana, in southern Indiana, and they were going to build a nuclear power plant in southern Indiana, 30 minutes from my house, Marble Hill, it was called. And Marble Hill was a big deal. I had a poster of Marble Hill on my wall, like I was that jazzed about it. But the
Nice.
residents just freaked out. They just, because 3 Mile Island had happened, this thing's getting built, and no one wanted it. And it was this huge deal, and they abandoned the project. It never actually went online. So for decades, it sat as a ghost town, and it just started deteriorating. And only in the last few years did they actually tear it down. Scariest part about the teardown was that when they were examining the concrete had terrible imperfections in it because, contracted out to the the cheapest bidder. And
Sure.
and they realized that they may have actually had an accident at some point, had it been constructed. But regardless, we never got nuclear energy. And there were, lots of promises of, cheaper energy and all of these things. So I saw the fear on a local level as well as like on a national level of seeing things like 3 Mile Island happen, and then of course Chernobyl, Fukushima. So all of these things, I think the public hears about these terrible disasters, but you don't hear about like a coal disaster or trouble at a wind farm, and I think that's the terrifying aspect of it. But I agree with you. I do feel it's the safest. But is that public relations perspective, is that the biggest problem for nuclear energy, or is it cost or waste disposal? Based on the history of those plants, I mean, all these things kind of weigh in. But is there a reason that new plants aren't being built? Is it a cost factor mainly?
So sort of. I mean, the American Nuclear Society did say that public communication was the #1 grand challenge because of public fear to things like any kind of nuclear event. A large part of the reason why you have right now issues with cost and schedule is because we haven't built one in 30 years, right? It might be cost effective to build an Apple iPhone right now, but if you didn't build one for 30 years, it's going to be kind of a nightmare to build another cell phone, which right now we just spit out quite quickly and easily.
Right.
And so that's probably a good analogy as to why they're being expensive right now. There's another issue with the expense, and that's that the political instability in the United States of having predictability. When it came to recycling, Jimmy Carter outlawed it. Ronald Reagan made it legal again. But that doesn't mean that investors are going to go ahead and put $10 billion up to make a recycling plant, because there's always that risk, maybe the political winds will change. And so if you can't find investors, then it's pretty difficult to build things like that. And so that becomes a big issue. When it comes to the issues of safety, back to what you had said a little bit earlier, a great analogy that I found was a Greek wind farm. There was a paper published on the safety metrics for wind farm. And it was about 4 deaths per 100,000 person hours, which actually makes it really safe. What that says is that it's really safe to work on a wind farm. Most of the deaths were falling off of a turbine, right? You get similar numbers with solar. You can fall off of roofs or material can fall on you. But the point is that at that death rate, it's like being in retail or government work. It's really safe to do that kind of work. But when you do the analysis, a wind farm, it's got very low energy density. You need a lot of materials to make a little bit of energy. And so if you said, well, I wanted to replace all of the nuclear energy of the United States with wind, you'd have to scale up a lot more of those. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so if you were to do that, I looked up the statistics for 2018, and you look up what the death rate that would result in if you replaced all of the energy from nuclear with it. Now, nuclear, it's about 20% of our electricity. So you'd have to have this huge array of wind farms. And at that death rate for that very safe industry, wind, it would have been about 2,800 deaths. Now for wind, they're distributed. They're not concentrated in a single event. It's just one person that falls off, and they might have one person fall off every year, every other year. And so it's a distributed death. But if you scaled it up to have the same energy as nuclear, it would have required about 2,500 deaths to get that much energy from wind instead of nuclear. And if you look up the statistics and you say, well, how many people died in nuclear? Do you want to guess how many people died in nuclear that same year, 2018?
How many?
0.
What?
So
Excellent. Yeah.
So it is the safest. It's just that once you've got this narrative that it's evil or deadly or dangerous, it's really difficult to divorce yourself of that, especially if that is tied in with your politics or your worldview in some way, and that you obtain some kind of security from assuming that that's the case and that we need to fight nuclear.
You mentioned a little while ago about, aging plants. So I live in New York now, and Indian Hills was just recently kind of decommissioned and shut down. So you mentioned we're not building new ones, and we've got this aging infrastructure of old ones. Tell me about the hazards of older nuclear power plants. Like, is there a threat there? Should we be worried about those?
So there is a threat, but the threat is far less than most people would assume. Let me give you an example. So at 3 Mile Island, there was a partial meltdown of the core, and all the radioactivity that released was about a week's worth of natural background radiation. And yet that terrified people. So the natural radiation that you get from living on the planet, the gammas that come up from the Earth, the solar and the cosmic rays and the radon in the air, you'd have basically doubled that dose for a week if you lived around there. It was such a small dose. It was innocuous. It was far less than you would get, say, from a nuclear medicine scan, just a small fraction of that. And yet that terrified people, right? But that's because they were built to be safe, right? That's why they're largely so expensive, is they're that safe. Fukushima is an extreme example of what can happen with a Western design. Now, we have those same kinds of boiling water reactors here in the United States, but because it had a containment, because of the safety standards that were there, if you look at what the United Nations and the World Health Organization and all the scientific review papers looked at, with their conclusion on all of the radioactivity from Fukushima, was that it still wasn't sufficient to produce any measurable medical effects. It was easily measurable, but it wasn't up to their level that would cause any statistically significant changes in anything that's radiogenic or a deterministic health effect. Even stochastic health effects. In other words, they said that there are no predicted increases in cancer rates or anything else. But what they did see were measurable health issues that came from fear. Specifically, the biggest one was the panicked evacuation. There were about a few thousand deaths from an evacuation, which literally meant, because the fear was so visceral with people with nuclear energy, that they risked and lost their lives to avoid something that wasn't even measurable. The radioactivity was measurable, but the health effects from it would not have been. And that's how terrified people are. So even with Fukushima, you had that kind of fear. And with these older nuclear power plants, the same kind of thing could happen, is that people would just panic and that they would hurt themselves because of the panic, because they're so afraid of it. And like I said, those same kind of nuclear reactors are here in the United States. So even though they're safe, to the point where, think about that, you have a major industrial source of energy, and the worst thing that can happen is that nobody gets hurt. And yet people hurt themselves over the fear of it. So that's still here in the United States. So fear is the biggest threat that we have when it comes to nuclear energy, just because people are, this word nuclear waste, people think that proves you shouldn't have nuclear energy without understanding the fundamentals or the technical basis for how we deal with nuclear waste.
And that might be worse in, kind of where we're at currently in the world, because all of those incidences happened before COVID. And we've seen kind of how the media narratives are just with vaccines. I can imagine if another event like this were to happen somewhere in the world, how you would have one scientist saying, it's all okay, no one panic, and another saying, get out of town, this is going to be the worst thing ever. That's just kind of how the media is now. It's so kind of polarized with how it's delivered that creating fear and panic is important to some news media, Like that's...
My favorite analogy with COVID is when you look at the anti-vaxxers and you listen to their rhetoric. Some of my favorite statements are ones that they use, or that people use for anti-nuclear. For example, an anti-vaxxer might say, but look at, still 1 in a million people get hurt with the vaccine, right? It's not 100%. I will take the vaccine when it's 100% safe. And that makes it sound like they're being noble and that they're being reasonable, but nothing in medicine is 100% safe. Never has been, never will be. And yet you can make that claim. It's not 100% safe. Would you take a chance with a vaccine that's not 100% safe, right? That sounds compelling. And that's the same narrative they give for nuclear. I will go with nuclear when it's 100% safe, when there's absolutely zero probability of anything wrong happening. If you did that with any medicine, medicine goes away because it's not possible. with anything is not possible to
Yeah.
have zero risk. And so a lot of the similar kinds of buzz lines, of sound bites that you got with anti-vax are the same kind of things that you get with anti-nuclear. So there was a lot of analogy there that I could see when it came. I mean, 3 years ago, I would have never imagined people would say vaccines are bad.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting with Dr. Fauci is that Dr. Fauci was around when the AIDS epidemic was happening, and
Right.
his choice of delivery to the public was really about fear. You know, fear this, fear this, fear this. He kind of created the program book for that, and he really sort of re-executed it with COVID. That fear it, fear it, fear it. You know, let's lock down, let's do these things because
Yeah.
the fear was a protective mechanism. And I don't know if that's the right thing to do psychologically with people or not, but you know, it might have curbed a lot of deaths in that regard. We were talking about older nuclear power plants. I imagine you're probably in a position where maybe you've seen plans for new plants.
Yes.
Are architecturally, engineering wise, these must be far greater and safer today,
They're
right?
impressive. Yeah, absolutely. My favorite, or let me put it, the easiest thing to communicate to the public about these new designs is the fuel changes. So the reason why 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and Chernobyl had meltdowns was because they had a phase change. There was a phase change in the core. With Chernobyl, the water flashed to steam. With 3 Mile Island, the fuel melted. With Fukushima, you had I guess that was more of the initial explosion, but the core meltdown that happened, that was a phase change. It went from solid to liquid when the core melted. And so the new fuel designs are not capable of a phase change. And the reason why is the reason you have a phase change with the fuel is that even though you shut the reaction off, the reactor is running at full power, making electricity. When you shut it off, the radioactivity in the core still exists and that's still generating heat. And even though it's only around 1% of the total power, that 1% still has to be removed from the core. And if you remove the coolant from the core, like what happened with Fukushima, you get a meltdown, or what happened with 3 Mile Island, you get a meltdown. And the new fuel designs are designed such that they can retain that heat and not have a phase change. For example, a liquid molten salt reactor, it's already liquid, so it's just going to heat up. Or the nitrizo particles, that 1% is just a little bit hotter than it is at the when it was running, and it can continue to heat up until all of that heat is passively decayed away. The physics that's taking place there that I haven't clarified was that even though you've only got 1% of the power there from radioactivity, the temperature will continue to rise until the heat extraction is equal to the heat generation rate. And when you have water running through it, you have a massive heat rejection rate because you got water running through the core. Without that water there's nothing removing the heat. And so that 1% radioactivity can cause the temperature to increase if the water is not there to remove it. So the biggest changes that were simple to explain are the prevention of a meltdown or a phase change in the fuel or in the core. So that part's pretty exciting. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff, all modern technology. I mean, the reactors we have now, they're designed in the 60s and built in the 70s. And if you talk about just the instrumentation, the materials, the technology, artificial intelligence, there's just a barrage of improvements that are there to be had that have a whole host of other improvements, like making the exclusion zone within the fence, which would be huge. You'd never have to evacuate, even if you had a meltdown. So a dizzying array of improvements are in store if we actually start building again.
Sure, sure. Well, you're obviously pro-nuclear energy. What are your feelings on nuclear weapons?
So a lot of my research is in nuclear nonproliferation. When I do thermoluminescent, optically stimulated luminescence, and electron paramagnetic resonance, a lot of that is nuclear forensics. That we're developing it to be sufficiently robust that you would not be able to have somebody anywhere in the world be able to start diverting nuclear material that would not be detectable. So that with the technology we're developing, the ultimate goal is to provide diplomats with or the international community with the with the argument that if you're going to try to proliferate, we're eventually going to find out. There's no way you can hide it. And if there's no way you can hide it, that gives incentive to such people to admit that they're doing it before they actually do it. The idea being, if you're going to do it and you know you're going to get caught, you may as well go ahead and try to get some extra bonus points by admitting you're doing it beforehand, so that everybody will try to give you something, rather than go all the way through to the end and make a risk that nobody's going to give you anything. And so by developing this technology, in theory, that means that the diplomats could deal with it before the military has to. That is always the end goal, is that is if somebody thinks that they need to have nuclear weapons, it's the diplomat's job to go and say, all right, why do you not feel secure? Why do you feel that you need to have this additional power to feel safe? And let them do their job, and we'll just keep doing good science.
Right. Let's talk about mobile nuclear energy for a minute. What are your feelings on like nuclear powered ships? I remember, hearing something a long time ago about when the Department of Defense wanted to issue contracts for nuclear powered vessels, that the Navy ended up being able to do this, but not the Air Force, because no one wanted airplanes with nuclear reactors to fall out of the sky. What about that? What about taking nuclear energy mobile? Is it still a thing of the future? Are you for nuclear powered ships? Could we have nuclear powered cars? Could these things be made small? If we were flying in airplanes with nuclear energy, would we be able to fly for $15 right now? Like, tell me this part. What do you feel the future is, or have we had it already?
All right, so there's a bunch of questions. I'll try to get those sequentially. To start off with, in a sense, we indirectly have nuclear powered cars, in that, at least in Research Triangle where I'm at, most of our electricity comes from nuclear energy. So if you're powering up your Tesla from the grid, that came from nuclear, right? Yeah, so that Tesla is indirectly nuclear powered. In terms of ships being nuclear powered, I think that's brilliant. They just need to adopt the same safety and quality standards that the U.S. Navy has for our submarines. I mean, we've been running nuclear submarines for 60 years, and we've had a stellar safety record, with those. And I think we could do even better, to be honest with you. But absolutely, that's a large fraction of global greenhouse gas emissions are for these large cargo vessels, and those should all be nuclear, in my opinion. There are just so many benefits. In terms of mobile nuclear, I would say it right now it looks like it's going to be inevitable, but it's not. It might not be what you think. Having attended a number of recent conferences and workshops put on by the national laboratories, particularly Idaho National Laboratory and affiliated ones, Oregon and so forth, the U.S. Army has made it clear that in order for them to reduce casualties and to guarantee success in a greenfield operation like what happened with Afghanistan, they need to be able to be divorced from fossil fuels, like what the Navy does, right? The Navy, when it has a nuclear power vessel, it only needs to stop for food. And if you can ship food in, it can run up to a decade potentially, or depending on how much fuel it has and how it uses it. And so when it came to the Army and having these caravans, these large arrays of fuel coming in, right? Because their tanks, their armored vehicles, their personnel vehicles, everything, diesel generators, it all runs on fossil fuels. And so they said, if you want us to have a guaranteed success and to bring your sons and daughters home at a much higher rate, you need to give us what you gave to the Navy. You need to give us these small portable microreactors, these small fission batteries that we can now electrify our entire fleet. So we want our tanks, our armored vehicles, our personnel carriers, our electricity, not to come from diesel generators and fossil fuels, but from these little microreactors like what the Navy has. And so Los Alamos, many of the national laboratories, Oak Ridge, and many universities like North Carolina State University are now working on these fission batteries. It would be a comparable size as to what you have with the Navy's reactors, but these would basically be little power generators that would give many tens of megawatts for upwards of a decade or more, that once we've developed these for the military, for their mission, right? Once they made that argument, right? If you want us to be able to win for some other, future Afghanistan thing, and you want us to bring your sons and daughters home, and you want us to have guaranteed success, you need to give us the same thing you gave the Navy. They can't hog this technology. We need that. For what we have. And so once we develop these fission batteries for the Army and we work through all of the security, so we've got to be able to make these things to sufficiently harden them in a war zone. Think about that, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I'm thinking, backhoes and reinforced concrete and some, whatever they do. The point is that once we've perfected it for the Army, this is the kind of thing that we can stick out in the middle of nowhere, where you want to have a large energy density for fission not fission batteries, for rechargeable batteries, like what the Army will have. These rechargeable batteries will allow them to, slap a battery pack on the back of a tank and let it go for 20 hours, and it'll have 2 or 3 spares, and so it can go for 2 or 3 days. And all it needs is somebody to recharge his battery, or to supply it with a new battery. And once that battery technology and that energy density is provided, then in theory we can wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, and we won't need gasoline anymore. We can go electric, because once we made it cost effective for the military to make all of their transportation rechargeable batteries fueled by nuclear energy, like what we have in Research Triangle, then it almost looks unstoppable right now, because this would divorce us from this massive addiction to fossil fuels. And with a lot of the newer reactor technology that's out there, you can reuse a lot of that heat for desalination, for processing, manufacturing, using heat right now. And a lot of manufacturing uses heat from fossil fuels just to do manufacturing. And you could couple that with the waste heat from nuclear and recycle that. And then if you even did recycling, a lot of these new reactors do like breeding, where you're taking old waste and using that, or depleted uranium and using that. And then on top of that, there's new technology that's just crazy, where we can now start to extract uranium passively from seawater for fuel. So you don't even need to go and dig a hole anymore. There's research out there that claims you can do it cost effectively. Right now, about 9 times the electrical energy needs of the United States is just dumped in the ocean every year, just over and over, replenished by plate tectonics. So in a sense, it's renewable. If we use that, it would just be renewable. We could passively remove it from the ocean, or even just from brackish water, trying to make fresh water for potable water. So I mean, I'm kind of rambling right now.
No, this is all great. But I do want to ask. So, what about planes, though? You mentioned battery packs for tanks, things like this. Would the same happen for planes?
So that's not where we're going. That's not where the scientific community is really going for planes. What we're proposing, what I've heard proposed what seems to be becoming the consensus in the scientific community, is a hydrogen economy. So when you go to the hydrogen economy, you can do a lot of fun stuff. If you've got an abundant amount of energy, say from nuclear, you can do carbon sequestration. And when you do that, you can take that carbon, or any other form of carbon, combine it with hydrogen to make liquid fuel. So combustion fuel. So if you did carbon sequestration and then you made jet fuel using nuclear energy, then you don't need to change the jets at all. You're just using synthetic jet fuel, but it's in a carbon neutral environment. And so the energy density that you get for liquid hydrocarbons enables jet travel. It also enables car travel. We just need that same kind of energy density in batteries, which apparently is where we're very rapidly approaching with the new electric cars that are out there. But there isn't the same hope to have that kind of energy density in batteries. I mean, it might come. We might do it with hydrogen fuel cells or something like that. But what seems to be the path of least resistance, without having any kind of scientific discoveries or revolutions, would be using modern technology. We could do it with carbon sequestration and hydrogen production to make synthetic jet fuel, or some kind of comparable synthetic fuel that could be burned in modern jets.
I can't help but wonder, as we could advance with more things becoming electric. Let's just use cars as the example. I can't help but wonder if electric cars wind up getting a significant market share, if we won't see kind of the oil exporting nations of the world just drastically dropping their prices, and there becomes kind of a price war. And then people are like, well, I can get gas so cheap now, like 50 cents a gallon. Like, why would I want to get an electric car? Do you see a battle of energy happening like that? Because you don't really hear a lot about whether there will be locked in rates for electricity to charge your vehicle, or will we see those inch upward when in theory we should be maybe paying less for the volume of energy that could be produced, particularly from maybe nuclear. But do you understand what I mean about like an energy war like that?
I do. I mean, there was a gentleman from London College, Malcolm Grissom, who had identified the original source of the anti-nuclear rhetoric being from the fossil fuel industry, right? Once you plant the seed of fear, it can really spread.
Gotcha.
And so that kind of rhetoric is almost inevitable. When you see that your only source of revenue is being taken by a different technology, right? You're going to need to try to find problems with that technology, right? And you're going to need to try to convince other people that the problems of that technology is not as bad as the problems of your technology.
Interesting.
I don't think that we're going to be completely divorced of fossil fuels in the next few centuries. It's just that unless we come up with a better way to make plastics, to make lubricants, my guess is that once we've divorced ourselves from it as burning, so we're no longer burning fossil fuels, and we're only using it to make products, useful products like a lubricant or plastic or those kinds of things. Eventually, I suppose that all could be made synthetically, but if it's cost effective now, I think that we'll continue to be using that long term, because it's not going to be a major source of environmental issues if we're only using it for products rather than burning it.
Sure. Let's do some myth busting for a minute. When I have guests on the show, I usually have a little private Facebook group. I tell people who's coming on, and they submit questions. So I've got some things here, some stuff we might have covered already, but I'm just going to kind of run through these and you can tear these apart. So the first question is there a higher chance of getting cancer when you live next to a nuclear power plant? You've kind of already addressed this, but just to go through this one more time real quick.
So in a practical sense, I would say no. The actual dose that you get from living next to a coal plant is actually going to be substantially higher just from natural radioactivity. But when it comes to a nuclear power plant, the regulations are that those dose rates at the fence have to be a fraction of natural background. So if you're off from the fence, they drastically reduce from there. The actual average dose that a person gets from all industrial activity is about 0.1% of your total annual accumulated dose. So the overwhelming majority of the dose you get is from radon. Half of all of the dose that you get on average is just from medical applications and medical sources. And again, 0.1% of all of that is from nuclear energy. So yeah, the chances of getting cancer are largely going to be driven by if you're afraid and that stress level increases to the point where it reduces your immune system. And if your immune system is reduced, then yeah, then you got an issue. But the biggest issues you have from nuclear energy, any health issues, are really just fear. And I could give you some overt examples, just mind-boggling, staggering examples of how fear overwhelmingly is the real killer when it comes to nuclear energy.
The next question is it true you can't put too much water in a nuclear reactor? I don't know what.
Yeah, you could put too much in. If you ran it through too fast, then you're not going to get very efficient heat transfer. And if you're not getting very efficient heat transfer, then the amount of boiling that you get is going to lower. And so your efficiency is going to reduce. So there's an optimal value that you want, and you're going to control that with your pumps. You're going to want to get as much heat out of that reactor as you can without basically you just want to have your efficiency as high as possible.
The next question is the Chernobyl reactor is burrowing a hole to the center of the earth.
No, they don't do that. When you melt rock, you can move through rock if you melt it. Even if you did take a molten nuclear reactor and you put it down into the mantle of the earth, what you should recognize is that the mantle is already molten, and the reason that it's molten is largely from radioactive decay of uranium and thorium and potassium and all their decay products. And so that's why we want to bury nuclear waste, is because what we've done is we've taken that energy that's the source of geothermal energy, and we've taken a little bit of it and we speeded up the process to get that decay heat out really, really quick to make steam. And then once it's a waste product, we put it back in the earth so that it can give its heat back to the earth where it was originally giving it. But we do it outside the biosphere so that it's just an innocuous point. So similar to what happens with volcanism, when the magma comes up, you're going to heat the earth. But what we do with nuclear waste is a small fraction of that, because we're not melting the earth that's around it. We're just heating it up a little bit, whereas magma will literally melt everything that it goes through. So the analogy is really one of fear-based, that even if you stuck it down in there, all you're really going to do is heat it up a little bit faster than what it was. And it's such a small amount compared to the vast amount of magma that's down there, that it would probably be beyond our ability to even measure the temperature increase once it diffused through there.
Sure.
Just such a small amount that we remove and fission compared to the total amount that's there.
Next question is, do nuclear plants generate hundreds of football fields worth of waste?
I'm sorry. I shouldn't laugh. All right. Let me give you the.
This is why we bust myths, because this stuff's ludicrous. I'm telling you.
So even if it did, that would still be fantastic. Let me give you the actual numbers. So since around the 1970s, about 20% of all of our electricity has come from nuclear energy. That's an enormous amount. That's a real enormous amount. And all of that nuclear waste from all that electricity would not fill up even one football field above 10 meters high. And so if you think about it, right, if one coal plant will be generating mountains of ash, just one coal plant. And we're talking, so the United States actually has the largest fleet of nuclear reactors. We have the largest capacity of nuclear reactors of any country on the planet. And the waste is just so small. Here, let me give you a different statistic. This one's probably better, giving the analogy of how much waste you get from other fuel sources, solar, wind, coal, whatever. If you do combustion, you get about 1 electron volt per atom that's taking place in the combustion process. 1 electron volt per atom when you burn something. If you do nuclear energy, if I fission uranium-235, I get over 200 million electron volts of energy from that one atom. And that reflects on how much fuel is needed, how much waste is needed, how much materials is needed, demonstrating why you need so little amounts of materials in terms of mining, milling, and manufacturing and processing, and then deployment, and then waste. Just a small amount of materials and a very tiny footprint for an enormous amount of energy, in a sense, makes nuclear the most environmentally friendly for any of the metrics that you're going to be associated with in terms of accident potential, in terms of accidents per gigawatt, in terms of square feet that are used, in terms of total materials, in terms of the impact to the earth, in terms of sustainability, which is why I mentioned the ANS says that the #1 grand challenge is public communication. I mean, if it's such an amazing thing, how is it that people think that it's so easy to think that it's evil and bad? As part of our ethnography, some of the papers have said nuclear waste being evil is part of the ethnography of our society as to why we should not do nuclear energy. Yeah. And it's just the opposite, overtly.
Well, I think people see, I thought it was interesting when you mentioned that, the initial kind of the smear campaign against nuclear might have come from the oil industry. I thought this was simply a Hollywood thing, an entertainment thing, that they engraved the threat of this into the world. Because if it wasn't a post-apocalyptic nuclear war movie or miniseries on TV, it was the China Syndrome or a movie about a nuclear, like anything they could do to pull drama. Because I feel like oftentimes, like, I never would have known or heard or seen a paper from the oil industry that would have talked about that, but I would have watched the movie that said it was bad. And that's my spin on it, is I think maybe this is Hollywood's fault.
Yes, they definitely play a role. Absolutely. Unequivocally. And I think they play the biggest role, to be honest with you.
So the next question, just as dumb: nuclear power plants can explode like a nuclear bomb.
This is true. So a nuclear bomb would require pure fissile metal. That means like pure uranium-235 or pure plutonium-239. And it would have to be metal. Even then, it's difficult to get it to explode like a nuclear bomb. The process to do that is top secret. How you do that is stuff that's the secrets of nations.
Mhm.
Now, when you have a nuclear power plant, you never have pure fissile metal. Even ones that are metal, you're going to have only a fraction of the uranium being the uranium-235, the fissile component. Uranium-238 is not fissile. It's the uranium-235. So you basically got to have pure uranium-235, which in nature, it's only about 0.7% of the uranium that's there. And so in a nuclear reactor, it's going to be uranium dioxide, at least modern reactors like we have today. They're all uranium dioxide. So you're already not going to be able to have fissile metal. On top of that, you've got structural materials, you've got cladding, you've got moderator. All of this material is just a big neutron poison for the kinds of super prompt critical reaction that you would need to have an atom bomb explosion. And so to put that in more perspective, a pure fissile metal might be the size of, I don't know, say a bowling ball or a basketball, or I don't know what size it is, some size that's like that. Basically, if you think of a nuclear missile, it fits in the tip of that, right? So think of something that's fitting in a nuclear missile compared to a nuclear reactor. That's going to be something like, I don't know, maybe 10 meters on an edge. So that's how drastically different the amounts of materials that are in there as opposed to pure fissile metal. So what you can have as opposed to a nuclear detonation is something like Chernobyl, if you had a Chernobyl type design where you had not a nuclear explosion, but a chemical explosion where the water flashed to steam. That's basically the same thing as a boiler explosion. That's what happened. Right. The water flashes to steam. And so if you do a bad design, you can expect bad results, which is what happened with Chernobyl. If you do you do a Western design like what we had, then the worst you could get would be Fukushima. In the United States, our worst example was 3 Mile Island, which, as I told you, given the actual consequences, is staggering. That, for the largest fleet of nuclear reactors, the worst thing that's ever happened is, somebody got scared. Mm-hmm. That was it. The worst thing that's ever happened. So it's pretty drastic to think about how strong that narrative has to be when the truth is so completely opposite.
The next question is, nuclear energy won't reduce my electric bill. I don't know if you can even answer that, but
yeah, I'd like to. So, let me give you a perspective after all these safety things I've been talking about. Let's say, for example, that I decided all Ford cars have to be able to be designed so that they can roll down a cliff, be submerged in a lake, and then withstand a tunnel fire. And after that, all the occupants have to be able to walk away. Right now, Ford would probably be able to design something like that, but it wouldn't be cheap. It wouldn't be easy. And it would be easy to say, well, I obviously don't want that. The idea that is that safe would be attractive, but they would just get priced out of the business. Everybody else that makes less safe would be getting the lion's share because very few people would be willing to pay the cost to have such a safe car. And that's basically where we are with nuclear, right? Remember I told you the death rate from wind versus the death rate from nuclear, right? That's because nuclear is expected to have that kind of a death rate, but you don't get that from wind. The risks that we incur from other energy sources are vastly larger than the risks we're willing to incur from nuclear. And if we say by regulation, I'm not saying that we should change the regulations from nuclear, but I would say that the risk acceptance criteria from all different energy sources should be the same. And then their prices would go through the roof. If they had to meet the same kinds of safety criteria that we have in nuclear, then nuclear would be the cheapest. But because we have to have such high safety standards and such low risk tolerances for nuclear, the price just goes through the roof.
Sure.
And as a result, if you want it to be that safe, you're just going to have to pay for it. And that's where we are with nuclear right now.
Right. The last question I have here for you is I find really interesting. I'm very curious what you're going to say about this. Nuclear energy wants to bust unions and put coal miners out of work. The nuclear industry employs fewer people than the coal industry.
Yeah, well, I don't know if there's anything about busting unions that has to do with that. I know that in the nuclear industry, the workers can and do unionize, and that's their business, and that's all fine and good. It's not about putting workers out of work. It's about working smarter. It's about being environmentally sustainable. It's about lowering risk. It's about going into the future with better technology with better energy resources. It's about improving the standard of living of our fellow human beings in a sustainable way. That's what nuclear is, in a nutshell.
Well, that's all I've got from the little myth-busting set of questions there. I appreciate you answering those. And moving on, just to kind of close this out, I just have a couple of things just kind of different than what we've been chatting about. I love that you express your religious beliefs out there. Like you've commented on this on TikTok. So I'm curious, did you grow up spiritual or religious? This has always been part of your life?
No, I mean, I was born in Utah. I was born a Mormon, but I never really adopted that worldview. My mother raised me with a secular humanist worldview, and I didn't actually become a Christian at all until because I had adopted an atheist worldview early on, and it wasn't until I started playing with Ouija boards that I started to see things that convinced me, no, the spiritual realm is real. There are things out there that are sentient, that are evil, and that's when I started reading the Bible and eventually became a Christian. It was simply because I started, I thought it was just Hollywood entertainment, Ouija boards, but no, I would say that from my experience that there are tangible forces that are real, and they can be very scary and pernicious.
Interesting. See, I would have thought you would have told me that you would have become an atheist when you became a scientist, because I've known a lot of people that have become, medical doctors or gone into the scientific community, and they lose their religion when they're in there. And I see that happen all too often. And so I'm always curious to know, how people find it or keep it. Do you feel there's a divide between science and religion?
Not in science. There is in the public arena, though. I find that, like on my TikTok, a lot of people. Initially, I just ignored it. I had a lot of people that were just making these comments. How can you be a scientist if you're a Christian? You can't be both. Pick, right? And be like, what is that to you? What do you care what religion I have, right? I mean, I know many people that are also Christians in the scientific community, or Muslim, or Hindu. What in science we ask how, we answer how. With religion, you ask and answer why. And there's no incompatibility there. If you're interested, if you think one is more important than the other, then that's your business, right? But a lot of us recognize that they're both interesting questions, not just how, but why.
For sure.
And how you choose to answer why is something that you're going to have to figure out on your own, right? You can ask a lot of people, and you can read a lot of things, and you can decide for yourself what makes sense as to why, purpose. Some people think purpose doesn't matter. I do. And we don't all have to have the same perspective on purpose, but that's really what it comes down to is why.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I love that answer. That's great. How can people find you out there on the interwebs?
You mentioned the TikTok channel. There are many hundreds of videos that have been generated over the years there. And that's Nuclear Science Lover, all is one word. It's Nuclear Science Lover. And that's where all those TikToks are that, like you said, crazy enough, went viral on nuclear science and technology on TikTok. It's hard to believe.
Well, you're following up. When this episode comes out, it will be in October, but you're following another TikTok star that I brought on who is a hospice nurse. So of all things to become popular on TikTok, a hospice nurse talking about death constantly. There's a market for anything on TikTok, really. So it's been really fun to kind of find people that I would have probably never come across before.
Indeed.
And Robert, I really appreciate you coming on and talking, and hopefully putting my listeners' ears at ease on this a little bit, and diffusing all the negativity around this, because I am a fan of nuclear energy. And terrified by nuclear weapons. So I think there's that people can choose, but you have to have the information to support those choices. And I think people just don't have the information, and you can't think you've seen it all from Hollywood, from the movies and from TV shows and things. So we got to hear it from an expert's mouth, which is what we got today. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I hope you come back again.
Be happy to.
Well, you have a good day, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Take care.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Hi everyone, I'm Todd Fischer, the host of the Cult Following podcast. Cult Following is a podcast that studies the personalities and common traits of cult leaders and their followers. Get the real story behind these infamous and oftentimes tragic cults from a new perspective through exhaustive research and from interviews with people that were there. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and Anthony Smith and is distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure and visit the official website for Metacortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.